opens lines for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for rapid central development and potential kingside initiative. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible choice, preparing for central pawn play and potentially eyeing the e4 square, while keeping the pawn structure fluid. Building central dominance, this pawn thrust immediately contests space and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the center with d6 embraces a more positional approach, allowing for flexible development and potential pawn breaks later. Embracing fianchetto development, white aims for kingside pressure and a solid pawn structure, anticipating potential queenside action. Unlocking knight mobility centralizes the piece, challenging white's queenside expansion and preparing for pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies the kingside fianchetto, eyeing the central dark squares and preparing for potential pawn pushes. Developing the bishop here prepares castling and aims to contest the center by potentially challenging white's kingside fianchetto. Saddling black's knight with a cramped existence, this advance immediately claims central territory and restricts enemy piece development. A bold repositioning that offers a knight escape route and probes the d-pawn's advanced guard. Immediately targeting the queenside, this gambit-like play aims to exploit black's slightly passive development and potential weaknesses around the b7 pawn, while also creating space for white's pieces to maneuver. The rook ventures to the back rank, a subtle repositioning that hints at potential defensive reinforcements on the queenside, or perhaps an ambitious d-pawn escort in a distant endgame. Ambitions on the kingside take flight, aggressively challenging black's knight and aiming to seize control of the e5 square. This pawn thrust, while bold, does open lines for black's queen and bishop should they find opportune squares. Gaining space on the queenside is the immediate goal here, aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure and potentially activate the rook along the b-file. Fortifying the central pawn chain, white now offers an exchange on e3, seeking to activate its dark-squared bishop and potentially exploit the weakened kingside if black accepts. Unlocking the queenside, b6 aims to develop the queenside bishop and potentially challenge white's central control with c5. This move signals a strategic counterplay on the flank, seeking to expand black's sphere of influence and disrupt white's ambitious central pawn push. It's a bid for queenside dynamism. Reinforcing the knight's central presence and preparing to contest the kingside initiative, this move elegantly sidesteps immediate tactical skirmishes, aiming instead for solid development and control over key squares as the position matures. Unlocking central counterplay, black bravely injects pawn tension, challenging white's space advantage and opening avenues for piece activity, especially along the newly forming queenside diagonal. This boldly claims a stake in the center and prepares to contest white's imposing pawn chain. Liberating the queen's pawn from its constraint now forces a decision on the dark-squared bishop, potentially opening lines or creating an isolated pawn situation depending on black's recapture. This creates a subtle imbalance, shifting the initiative as white prioritizes piece activity over pawn structure. Opening up that bishop to the long diagonal immediately targets white's central pawn structure and adds pressure to the c-file, potentially leading to tactical exchanges and influencing the pawn chain's integrity. Developing the knight to c3 fortifies the center and prepares to contest the d5 pawn, a crucial outpost that black's knight on e5 now eyes with suspicion. Sharpening the pawn structure on the queenside now with e6 aims to consolidate black's position, preventing white's knight from hopping into d5 and opening a path for the f8 bishop. It's a positional maneuver, acknowledging white's ambitious kingside pawn thrust and seeking to solidify the center before the storm potentially breaks. Unleashing a knight to a precarious outpost on b5, white boldly challenges black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn chain and potentially fork the rook and bishop. A decisive decision to activate the queen, aiming to challenge the central tension and prepare for pawn advances, while acknowledging the slight risk of exposing the monarch to potential knight forks. Securing the monarch initiates a crucial phase, transitioning from tactical skirmishes to positional maneuvering where white intends to exploit the newly opened kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing the d5 outpost and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Consolidating its queenside presence, black opts to develop its bishop, a seemingly passive choice that nonetheless prepares for a central pawn push, aiming to break open lines and activate its minor pieces. Forging a direct line to the opponent's queenside, the rook on d1 aims to seize control of the d-file, creating potential pressure and limiting black's queenside maneuvering options as the pawn structure solidifies. Sacrificing the bishop here initiates a thematic exchange designed to alleviate pressure on the queenside and potentially open lines for counterplay, even though it cedes the bishop pair and allows white's knight to gain a foothold. Clearing the c-file opens a direct avenue for your rook, aiming to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's queenside pawns once they are forced to move. This pawn thrust aims to shatter white's central grip and open attacking avenues for black's pieces, particularly challenging the e3 bishop and the b5 knight, which now becomes vulnerable. Initiating a forceful pawn advance toward black's queenside, this knight maneuver aims to exploit the precariousness of white's doubled pawns and create active play by threatening to dislodge black's knight. A bold gambit, sacrificing material for the initiative on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's central control and exploit the newly opened diagonal. Unleashing a pawn storm signals an aggressive intention, seeking to pry open lines and exploit any lingering structural weaknesses around black's king. Pushing the knight back to e7 sacrifices tempo and allows white's pieces to consolidate their central influence, particularly the advanced pawn on d5. Here's a breakdown of why this move is problematic and what black should be considering. Loss of tempo, * black's knight has already moved twice, nf6 nc6 n5, and now it's retreating yet again. Each knight move is valuable, and spending multiple moves to reposition a piece while the opponent develops freely and builds a strong center is generally a losing proposition. White's central control, ***, white's pawn on d5 is now extremely strong, supported by the knight on d4 and the queen on b3. It restricts black's pieces, particularly the queenside. Black's bishop on c8 is still undeveloped, and the pawn structure around it is compromised. King safety, * while black's king isn't immediately threatened, the crowded nature of black's position and the lack of active piece play create potential future vulnerabilities. White's queen on b3, for instance, eyes the b7 pawn and potentially the kingside if white can open lines. Positional weaknesses. The pawn on c5, while attempting to contest the center, is now a weakness after white's pawn push. Black's pieces are also somewhat uncoordinated. Instead of this retreat, black should have been looking for ways to challenge white's central setup more directly. Moves like c6 to support the d5 pawn or finding active squares for the remaining minor pieces were more pressing. The current move allows white to continue improving their position without facing significant resistance. Unleashing an immediate pawn sacrifice, white aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and create open lines for their pieces, particularly targeting the vulnerable king's flank. This bold gambit forces black to confront a significant decision regarding the capture, as accepting it will likely lead to a dynamic, perhaps chaotic middle game where piece activity and tactical prowess will be paramount. The exchange at e6 fundamentally alters the pawn landscape, potentially opening the f-file for white's rook and creating immediate threats against black's castled king. Embracing the doubled pawns on the f-file with this capture creates a dynamic imbalance, opening avenues for your pieces while simultaneously solidifying white's central pawn chain and creating a protected passed pawn on d5. Your king now has a slight exposure, a consequence of this sharp exchange, demanding careful defensive coordination. Unleashing a bishop to the more active diagonal, the intention is to pressurize black's kingside and potentially eye weaknesses around that vulnerable monarch. Initiating a queen trade here offers a curious strategic ambiguity, potentially simplifying into an endgame where white's knight on d4 gains significant scope and pressure against black's slightly awkward pawn structure on the queenside. Alternatively, this capture could be a calculated attempt to disrupt white's centralized pieces and gain a tempo by forcing a response. though the resulting pawn configuration for black following white's recapture needs careful consideration. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chains, this move seizes the open d-file and initiates a battle for control over the central pathway, forcing black's knight to a less influential square and opening aggressive avenues towards the kingside. A daring castling maneuver, this decision to tuck the king away creates a critical pawn structure on the kingside, a delicate balance that white will surely probe. The opened kingside files now become a potential highway for white's rooks, demanding vigilance and precise defense from black. This is a pivotal moment where the king's safety is paramount, even at the cost of potential kingside pawn weaknesses. Expanding white's queenside influence by activating the rook and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the file aims to secure more space for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure, a common theme when a queenside majority exists or can be cultivated. Sensing an opportunity, black injects dynamism by immediately challenging the central pawn structure and eyeing the vulnerable white queen's flank. A bold attempt to unravel black's kingside pawn structure, injecting immediate dynamism and threatening to splinter the defenses with the advanced pawn. Instigating a pawn storm on the queenside, black chooses to activate the queen to d6, aiming to support the advancing pawns and contest the now open c-file. This maneuver aims to create counterplay and potentially exploit the pawn structure white has created, offering a new battleground away from the kingside where white might otherwise be tempted to attack. Exploiting the open file, this capture is a tactical probe that forces black to commit their queen, potentially creating targets for white's raking pieces, while simultaneously weakening the pawn structure around the black monarch. Unpacking this pawn exchange opens lines of communication for your forces along the a-file, turning a seemingly static position into a fluid battlefield where pawn structure dictates the tempo and tactical opportunities. Initiating an assault on the queenside, Ka3 immediately targets the unprotected b6 pawn, creating immediate pressure and forcing black to defend. This proactive approach aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially exploit weaknesses that arise from the forced pawn moves. A bold foray, challenging the centralized white pieces and aiming to destabilize the queenside pawns, while simultaneously seeking active piece play by confronting the bishop on h3 and potentially freeing the knight for deeper penetration. Simplifying the position through exchanges, this captures the bishop and immediately addresses black's active queen by forcing a trade. White aims to leverage the open files and potentially exploit black's slightly less coordinated pieces in the ensuing endgame. Reclaiming the knight is a logical reaction to white's queen trade, aiming to untangle a somewhat cramped position and restore material equilibrium while also preparing to contest central influence. Securing the knight's advanced outpost on e5 presents a significant positional advantage, as this piece now obstructs black's pawn structure and limits the mobility of their remaining pieces, particularly the bishop on c8. Asserting control over the open files is paramount now, and this placement of the rook prepares to contest the d-file, aiming to activate it into the now imbalanced structure arising from the capture on c6 and subsequent pawn exchanges. Prying open the file with this rook maneuver creates immediate pressure along that edge, potentially isolating the black king later if white can achieve further pawn advances or piece exchanges. The knight aggressively penetrates to the heart of white's camp, creating an immediate tactical headache and challenging the control of the c-file. Unlocking the potential of the now open c-file, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's coordinated defense and exploit the exposed nature of the rook on d8. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, this maneuver seeks to disrupt white's queenside advantage and create counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens a decisive assault along the now vacant kingside, aiming to dismantle black's defensive structure. Relinquishing the formidable queenside pressure after white's forceful pawn push, black strategically re-engages the rook on the now open b-file, a crucial avenue for counterplay in this materially simplified, yet positionally tense, middle game. Re-establishing pressure on the queenside is paramount as the bishop on f2 prepares to join the assault, potentially targeting the weakened b6 pawn or even orchestrating a kingside sortie once other pieces are better coordinated. Reclaiming the open c-file seems to be the immediate goal here, as your knight vacates its defensive post on d6, inviting white to immediately occupy that central highway with their rook and potentially squeeze black's position further. Pushing the g-pawn signals a bold attempt to pry open lines for the king's attacker, potentially creating mating threats, or at least disrupting black's pawn structure around the king. A bold repositioning of the knight from f5 to e7, aiming to shore up the kingside and potentially offer support to the central pawn structure, though it relinquishes direct pressure on white's queenside initiative, potentially allowing further incursions along the open file. A bold attempt to ignite activity on the kingside, pushing the g-pawn might create attacking opportunities, but also potentially weakens white's own king's safety if black can exploit the open g-file. A bold assertion of control over the d-file, rerouting the rook to join the battle for open lines and potential breakthroughs, signaling an intent to challenge the opponent's recently consolidated structure. Pushing the pawn forward opens a vital g-file, potentially creating weaknesses around black's king and offering a new avenue for peace pressure that was previously blocked. Reactivating the knight to its central outpost after a brief detour to the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's attacking structure and potentially secure the e7 square for a future pawn push. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, white sacrifices the bishop to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and open lines towards the exposed king. Confronting the doubled pawns is a brave, albeit potentially premature, decision, seeking to exploit the isolated nature of white's rook on the 7th rank and the potential weakness on the kingside that has been created. Exploiting the open files, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's rook coordination and potentially launch a devastating kingside attack. A daring pawn sacrifice to shatter the central blockade and open lines. This gambit aims to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain and inject dynamism into the position. By offering the pawn, black hopes to activate their remaining pieces, particularly the rook on d8, and potentially create attacking opportunities against white's somewhat exposed king. It's a sharp decision, accepting the challenge of untangling black's pieces in a more open, albeit potentially dangerous, battlefield. The success of this move hinges on black's ability to coordinate their forces effectively and exploit the resulting imbalances before white can consolidate. The ensuing play will likely be tactical and require precise calculation. Liberating the rook from its doubled position suddenly opens up the d-file, creating a potent attacking avenue against black's potentially exposed king. Accepting the sacrifice, black reclaims the material, but the ensuing pawn structure on the queenside, particularly the isolated pawn, might become a long-term liability as we transition into an endgame scenario. A crucial check exploiting the doubled pawn's immobility. This bishop sacrifice rips open a path for the rook and threatens to unravel black's fragile pawn structure entirely. The king's desperate dash across the board finally brings it to a slightly less exposed square, though the ongoing struggle for initiative means this reprieve is likely temporary. Establishing the passed pawn's dominance now becomes paramount, forcing the black king into a more exposed position as it tries to contain this burgeoning threat on the queenside. Saddling the opponent's knight with the isolated b-pawn creates a significant structural weakness that the rook now needs to defend at all costs. Asserting dominance over the crucial 7th rank now becomes paramount for white, aiming to penetrate black's defenses and exploit the exposed monarch. Unlocking the blocked pawn on b7 now becomes paramount, aiming to create a passed pawn threat and disrupt white's king's safety. The bishop now occupies a remarkably active diagonal, eyeing the weakened pawns and potentially disrupting black's coordination, even as white prepares to consolidate. This audacious pawn thrust, a desperate attempt to activate a dormant piece, creates a precarious situation, potentially opening lines for white's aggressive pieces or providing a useful blockade. Fleeing the imminent mating net that black's rook and knight are weaving on the kingside is the immediate priority, as the white monarch has become a significant liability with the g-pawn now advanced. re-establishing a knight's presence on a central outpost. This maneuver aims to shore up the beleaguered pawn chain and potentially create counterplay against white's advancing kingside structure. Unleashing a pawn to secure a critical promotion square forces black's hand. The knight's desperate lunge towards white's weakened king, a bold gambit to disrupt the encroaching pawn and potentially snag material. But it overlooks the immediate defensive advantage the rook now possesses on the 7th rank. Unleashing the queen to its final, crowning destiny transforms the board, immediately asserting overwhelming pressure on black's scattered defenses and preparing to harvest the remaining pawns with decisive regal authority. A desperate attempt to prolong the inevitable, sacrificing a pawn to create a temporary distraction as the king remains exposed. The king's frantic dance finally ends as it bravely steps into the fray to capture the pesky pawn, a crucial moment for controlling the advancing e-pawn and preventing its promotion. A desperate flight, seeking a stalemate by perpetual check, but the king's escape routes are thoroughly blocked. Initiating the king's perilous journey into the enemy's territory offers a desperate glimmer of counterplay, but the inherent risks of exposing the monarch so dramatically are immense. A desperate attempt to stir up chaos, throwing the white king into immediate peril by leveraging the advanced pawn and the loose knight on b7. The king boldly ventures forward, seeking the relative safety of the center's embrace, a calculated risk given the exposed pawn structure. A final desperate attempt to disrupt white's overwhelming material advantage by forcing the enemy monarch into a vulnerable central position, hoping for a stalemate or a perpetual check scenario. The king steps forward, embracing danger to secure the pawn's advancement. The knight's bold sortie disrupts the king's meager shelter, forcing a stark choice between immediate material loss and enduring a dangerous discovered check sequence. Navigating the endgame's precipice, this maneuver aims to shepherd the monarch away from immediate checks and potential encirclements.